The diesel engine coughed to life in the predawn darkness of October 23, 1942. Inside the cramped hull of the Type 97 Chiha medium tank, Commander Sergeant Ichiro Tanaka felt the familiar vibration through the soles of his boots. The 170-horsepower Mitsubishi air-cooled engine settled into its characteristic rumble. Outside, 8 more tanks were starting their engines along the western bank of the Matanikau River on Guadalcanal. 9 tanks total. The first independent tank company. This was it. Tanaka stood in his turret position, the only position available to him. There was no seat for the tank commander in a Chiha. He would fight standing up, as he always did. His responsibilities were enormous and impossible. Command the tank, operate the 57mm main gun, load that same gun, traverse the turret by hand crank, and somehow, in between all of that, fire the rear-facing 7.7mm machine gun, mounted at the 5 o'clock position on the turret. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 1 man, 5 jobs, no room to move. This was how Japanese tank commanders fought. This was what they'd been trained for. And until this moment, on this distant island in the Solomon Chain, it had been enough. The Chiha had crushed Chinese resistance. It had torn through Malayan jungles where British commanders swore tanks could never go. It had supported infantry across the Philippines and Burma. The tank worked. The tactics worked. The design philosophy that prioritized mechanical simplicity and infantry support over crew comfort had proven itself again and again. Tanaka had no reason to doubt his machine. The Chiha weighed 14.3 tons, light enough to cross questionable bridges and traverse soft ground where heavier tanks would bog down. Its armour ranged from 8mm on the belly to 25mm on the gun mantlet and upper hull. Not thick by European standards, but sufficient. The armour had been designed to resist rifle and machine gun fire, and it did exactly that. Against Chinese forces with virtually no anti-tank weapons, against British colonial troops caught off guard in Malaya, the protection had been adequate. The tank's low silhouette made it difficult to spot at distance. The bell crank suspension, though crude and uncomfortable, was reliable and easy to maintain. The air-cooled diesel engine ran for hours without overheating, even in tropical heat. Everything about the Chiha reflected careful consideration of Japan's industrial limitations and tactical requirements. It was not the best tank in the world, but it was the tank Japan could build in the numbers needed, and for the enemies initially faced, that had been sufficient. Tonight would be different. Tonight, Tanaka and his company would cross the sandbar at the mouth of the Matanikau River and assault American Marine positions defending Henderson Field. The airfield was everything. If the Japanese could recapture it, if they could deny the Americans that precious runway, the strategic situation on Guadalcanal would shift dramatically. Without Henderson Field, without the fighters and dive bombers operating from its crude runway, American ships couldn't safely approach the island. Supply would become impossible. The Marines would wither. General Haruyoshi Hyakutake had come to Guadalcanal personally to direct this offensive. He'd brought the 2nd Division, thousands of infantry troops who were at this moment struggling through the jungle south of Henderson Field, preparing to attack from an unexpected direction. But those infantry needed support. They needed the Marines distracted, pulled west toward the Matanikau. That's where the tanks came in. The plan was straightforward. At dusk on October 23rd, the 9 tanks of the 1st Independent Tank Company would advance along the beach and cross the Matanikau River at its mouth, where a sandbar provided the only route for armoured vehicles. Infantry from the 4th Regiment would follow. Once across, the tanks would turn east and assault the Marine positions directly, throwing the defenders into confusion. With the Marines engaged along the Matanikau, General Maruyama's forces would strike from the south. Henderson Field would fall within hours. It was an ambitious plan. It required coordination between widely separated forces over difficult terrain. It required the tanks to cross a river mouth under fire and then engage fortified positions. But Japanese tank doctrine had always emphasized aggressive action. The Chiha was designed for offensive warfare, for supporting infantry assaults, for breaking defensive lines through shock and firepower. This was exactly the mission for which the tank had been built. Tanaka checked his periscope. Through the crude optics, he could see the lead tanks beginning to move. 2 Type 97s first, their diesel engines growing louder as they accelerated. Behind them came 2 Type 95 Hago light tanks, even smaller and lighter than Tanaka's Chiha. The remaining 5 Chihas followed in loose formation, all 9 tanks clanking and clattering eastward along the coastal road toward the river. The sun had set perhaps 30 minutes earlier. The tropical twilight faded quickly at these latitudes. Within the hour, it would be fully dark, and darkness favoured the attacker. The Marines would hear the tanks coming, certainly, but seeing them, engaging them accurately in the darkness, that would be more difficult. Night attacks had proven effective for Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. Infantry could close with American positions, get inside the defensive perimeter, fight at close range where superior numbers and aggressive tactics could overcome American firepower advantages. The tanks would do the same thing. Get close, get among the Marine positions, use their machine guns to suppress infantry while the 57mm guns engaged strong points and bunkers. Japanese tank crews trained extensively for night operations. They knew how to navigate by landmark, how to maintain formation in darkness, how to coordinate attacks when radio communication was impossible. Only 1 tank in 4 carried a radio set. Tanaka's tank was not one of them. He would follow visual signals from the command tank, watch for hand signals and flag signals from other crew members when they could be seen, and rely on his own judgment when visibility dropped to nothing. This was standard. This was how Japanese armor operated. Individual tank commanders were expected to understand the mission, understand the terrain, and make independent decisions to accomplish objectives even when central control broke down. Inside the turret, Tanaka had barely enough room to stand. The turret, ring diameter, measured just 1,200 millimeters, 47 inches, less than 4 feet across. In that space, he had to operate the hand-cranked turret traverse, manipulate the gun controls, load ammunition from racks mounted on the turret walls, and somehow maintain situational awareness through a small periscope and the commander's cupola vision blocks. American tankers, who would later examine captured Chihas, would find the working conditions almost incomprehensible. Sherman tank commanders had a dedicated position with proper seating, a cupola with 6 vision blocks providing all-around observation, and a crew of 3 men in the turret to share the workload. The Japanese approach was different. Japanese tank doctrine emphasized minimizing crew size to keep the tank small and light. A smaller tank presented a smaller target. A lighter tank could cross bridges and navigate terrain that would stop heavier vehicles. These were valid design considerations, given Japan's industrial limitations and the Pacific Theater's infrastructure. But they came at a cost. The cost was paid by men like Tanaka, standing in turrets too small to turn around in, performing multiple tasks simultaneously, fighting with equipment that required constant physical effort to operate. The turret traverse was entirely manual. There was no power assist, no gyrostabilizer, no hydraulic system. To rotate the turret, Tanaka had to crank a handle, using muscle power to swing several tons of steel and the mounted gun through whatever arc was required. It was exhausting work. After an hour of combat, a tank commander's arms would be burning with fatigue. The gun itself, the Type 97 57mm cannon, was an infantry support weapon. It had been carried over from the earlier Type 89 tank and was designed to fire high-explosive shells against fortifications and enemy positions. The gun had a short barrel and relatively low muzzle velocity. It was not an anti-tank weapon. It was not designed to penetrate armor. When Chihas had encountered Soviet tanks at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, the 57mm gun had proven almost useless against even lightly armored BT-5 and BT-7 tanks. Soviet 45mm guns outranged the Japanese weapon and could penetrate Chiha armor from distances where Japanese tanks couldn't effectively return fire. That experience had led to the development of a new 47mm high-velocity gun, and the creation of the improved Type 97 Shin-Hoto Chiha variant with a larger turret and better anti-tank capability. But that tank had only entered production in 1942. The tanks sitting at the Matanikau River mouth in October of that year were original model Chihas with the older turret and the short-barreled 57mm gun. Against fortifications and infantry, they would be effective. Against enemy armor, they would struggle. But Tanaka had no intelligence suggesting American tanks were in the area. The Marines defending the Matanikau positions were infantry, dug into defensive positions along the eastern bank of the river. They had machine guns, rifles, perhaps some mortars and artillery. Against such targets, the Chiha would perform as designed. The armor would protect the crew from small arms fire. The main gun would destroy bunkers and strongpoints. The machine guns would suppress enemy infantry. Standard tactics for infantry support missions. The column of tanks reached the approach to the river. Through his periscope, Tanaka could see the lead Chiha beginning to navigate down onto the sandbar. The Matanikau River here was perhaps 40 meters wide, flowing swiftly out of the jungle highlands toward the sea. At the mouth, a sandbar had formed, wide enough for vehicles to cross at low tide. The Japanese had scouted the crossing point carefully. They knew it was passable. They knew the Marines controlled the eastern bank. They knew this assault would be opposed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know until the moment arrived, was exactly what opposition they would face. The Marines had been on Guadalcanal for more than 2 months. They'd fortified their positions, registered their artillery, planned their fields of fire. The defensive line at the Matanikau was not a hasty position thrown together in a few hours. It was a carefully prepared strongpoint designed to prevent exactly this kind of attack. Marine forward observers had been watching the western bank of the Matanikau for days. They'd seen Japanese troops massing. They'd reported tank sounds. Artillery forward observers had calculated firing coordinates for the likely Japanese approach routes. Anti-tank gun crews had positioned their 37mm M3 guns to cover the sandbar crossing. Machine gun teams had set up interlocking fields of fire. Everything was ready. At exactly 1,830 hours, as full darkness settled, over Guadalcanal, the first Chiha tank reached the sandbar and began crossing the Matanikau River. The second tank followed, then the 2 Hargos, then Tanaka's tank. The roar of diesel engines echoed off the riverbanks, tracks through sand and water as the vehicles navigated the uneven surface of the bar. It was impossible to cross quietly. It was impossible to cross without being noticed. Marine sentries on the eastern bank heard the tanks immediately. Within seconds, reports were racing up the chain of command. Enemy armor crossing the Matanikau. At least 9 vehicles. Maybe more. The perimeter alert system activated. Marines grabbed weapons and moved to fighting positions. Anti-tank gun crews traversed their pieces toward the sound of approaching engines. Inside his tank, Tanaka could hear nothing but the roar of his own engine and the clatter of tracks on sand and stone. The Chiha's vision equipment was minimal, forcing him to rely almost entirely on his periscope and the small vision port in the turret. In the darkness, with spray from the river and sand churned up by tracks ahead, visibility approached 0. He was driving toward enemy positions essentially blind, trusting that the tanks ahead would lead him through, trusting that Japanese infantry would follow and support the armor once they'd crossed. The first Chiha cleared the sandbar and began climbing the eastern bank. The second tank followed. Then, something happened that would fundamentally change everything Tanaka believed about his tank, his tactics, and his chances of survival. Something that would reveal a truth Japanese tank crews had somehow avoided confronting until this moment. The Marines opened fire. Not with rifles, not with the small arms fire the Chiha armor was designed to resist. The Marines opened fire with heavy weapons. 37mm anti-tank guns engaged the lead tanks immediately, but more significantly, more devastatingly than anyone on the Japanese side had anticipated, Marine machine gunners began firing their Browning M250 caliber heavy machine guns at the approaching armor. The M2 Browning was not a rifle. It was not a light machine gun. It was a crew-served heavy weapon designed during World War I to engage aircraft and destroy light vehicles. It fired a 12.7mm round at a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,900 feet per second. The standard ammunition load included armor-piercing rounds, specifically designed to defeat light armor and fortifications. At close range, the M2 armor-piercing round could penetrate 23mm of face-hardened steel armor plate. At 500 meters, it could still penetrate 19mm. The Chiha's side armor measured 20mm. The rear armor measured 10 to 12mm. Simple arithmetic revealed a terrible problem that Japanese tank designers had not adequately considered. The 50 caliber machine gun, a weapon the Americans mounted on jeeps, on half-tracks, on virtually every vehicle in their arsenal, had sufficient penetrating power to defeat Chiha armor at combat ranges. The first 50 caliber rounds struck the lead Chiha as it climbed the riverbank. The sound was distinctive, different from the ping and ricochet of rifle bullets bouncing off armor. These rounds didn't bounce. They punched through. Marines manning 50 caliber machine guns in prepared positions along the eastern bank fired sustained bursts into the sides and rear of the Japanese tanks as they navigated up from the sandbar. Armor-piercing tracer rounds arced across the darkness in brilliant orange-red lines. Where they struck armor, they penetrated cleanly. Inside the lead tank, the crew experienced something far worse than combat. They experienced revelation. The heavy machine gun fire wasn't making loud impacts on the exterior of the hull. It was coming through, rounds penetrating the armor, entering the fighting compartment, striking. Equipment ricocheting off internal surfaces, killing and wounding crew members in the cramped interior where there was nowhere to hide. A Chiha tank measured just over 4 meters long and 2 meters wide. Inside, the fighting compartment provided perhaps 50 cubic feet of space for the commander. When armor-piercing rounds penetrated that space, when bullets entered one side and exited the other with enough energy remaining to tear through equipment and flesh, the realization was immediate and terrifying. The tank had not protected them. The armor they had trusted with their lives offered no meaningful protection against weapons the Americans used as standard infantry support. This was not supposed to happen. This was not how tank armor worked. Throughout training, throughout campaigns in China and Malaya, small arms fire had been ineffective against tanks. Bullets made noise on the outside. They didn't come through, but these bullets came through. The second Chiha, still on the sandbar, began taking 50 caliber fire from multiple positions. Marine machine gunners had registered their fire on the sandbar during daylight. They knew the range. They knew the traverse. In the darkness, tracer rounds showed them where their bullets were going. They adjusted fire, kept shooting, kept pumping armor-piercing rounds into the thin steel skin of the Japanese tanks. One Marine machine gunner, positioned in a fortified position near the river mouth, engaged a Chiha at approximately 150 meters. He fired a sustained burst into the tank's side armor. His tracer rounds illuminated the impact points. He could see his bullets striking. He could see sparks. And then he saw something that would be reported up the chain of command and discussed in Marine intelligence briefings for the remainder of the campaign. He saw his tracer rounds coming through the other side of the tank. The 50 caliber armor-piercing bullets punched completely through the Chiha, entering the port side armor and exiting the starboard side. Another machine gunner aimed specifically at a tank's engine compartment. The rear deck of the Chiha, where cooling vents allowed air to flow around the diesel engine, was protected by only 6 millimeters of armor. 6 millimeters. Less than a quarter inch. The 50 caliber rounds went through like the armor wasn't there. Inside the engine compartment, bullets struck cylinders, shattered cooling fans, punctured fuel lines. The diesel engine seized. The tank stopped moving, becoming a stationary target silhouetted against the dark water of the river behind it. Tanaka, third in the column, witnessed the destruction of the first two Chihas. Through his periscope, he saw them stop, saw muzzle flashes from Marine positions, saw the continuous streams of tracer fire converging on Japanese armor. His driver, seeing the tanks ahead disabled, instinctively slowed. The tank behind Tanaka's closed up, nearly colliding. The neat column formation dissolved into confusion on the sandbar as tanks tried to maneuver around disabled vehicles while under intense fire. The 37mm anti-tank guns joined in. Unlike the machine guns, which required sustained fire to achieve penetration, the 37mm M3 gun could defeat Chiha armor with a single well-placed shot. Armor-piercing rounds from these weapons struck with devastating effect. Turrets were knocked off hulls. Ammunition detonated inside crew compartments. Tanks exploded, their internal fuel and ammunition igniting in catastrophic fires that turned the vehicles into pyres. Japanese tank commanders who survived the initial barrage couldn't process what was happening. They had trained for years. They had combat experience. They knew their equipment. They understood that anti-tank guns would be dangerous, that dedicated anti-armor weapons could destroy their tanks. That was expected. That was the nature of armored warfare. But machine guns, infantry support weapons, those were supposed to be ineffective against tanks. That was fundamental. That was why tanks existed. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun was never intended as a primary anti-tank weapon. It was designed to shoot down aircraft, to destroy light vehicles, to provide heavy suppressive fire against enemy positions. Against European tanks with armor measuring 30, 40, 50 millimeters or more, the 50 caliber was largely ineffective. It might damage external equipment, might injure exposed crew members, but it couldn't penetrate the hull. Against German armor, American troops needed dedicated anti-tank guns, bazookas, tank destroyers. Against Japanese armor, they needed a machine gun. The revelation hitting Japanese tank crews on the Matanikau sandbar that night represented more than tactical defeat. It represented the collision of design philosophy with material reality. The Chiha had been engineered based on specific assumptions about the enemies Japan would face and the weapons those enemies would deploy. Those assumptions, reasonable when the tank was designed in the mid-1930s, had become fatally outdated by October 1942. Japanese engineers had studied tank warfare carefully. They'd examined foreign designs, analyzed combat reports from China, considered the industrial and logistical constraints Japan faced. The result was a design philosophy that prioritized mobility, mechanical reliability, and ease of production over crew protection and firepower. This wasn't incompetence. It was pragmatism given Japan's circumstances. The armor specifications reflected that philosophy. 25 millimeters maximum thickness was calculated to stop rifle and light machine gun fire at combat ranges. Against 7.7 millimeter rifle bullets, against even the heavier 13 millimeter rounds used by some nations, 25 millimeters of face-hardened steel armor provided adequate protection. The face-hardening process, which made the outer surface harder than the interior core, caused smaller projectiles to shatter on impact rather than penetrate. But the 50 caliber armor-piercing round operated in an entirely different energy regime. The projectile weighed 52 grams and traveled at nearly 3,000 feet per second at the muzzle. The kinetic energy was sufficient to break through the hardened outer layer and continue through the softer interior steel with momentum to spare. At close range, under 200 meters, the round had approximately twice the penetrating power needed to defeat Chiha armor. It wasn't a close contest. It wasn't a question of lucky shots or perfect angles. The mathematics were unforgiving. Tanaka's tank finally cleared the sandbar and reached the eastern bank. His driver maneuvered around one of the burning Chihas, steering toward what looked like an opening in the marine defenses. But there was no opening. Every approach route had been covered. As Tanaka's tank turned parallel to the beach, exposing its side armor, a marine machine gunner at the defensive perimeter opened fire. The 50 caliber rounds struck the turret side armor. 20 millimeters thick, 20 millimeters that might as well have been paper. The rounds came through. Tanaka felt the impacts, felt something strike his leg, felt hot metal fragments ricocheting inside the turret. The loader, positioned below and behind him, made a sound, not a scream, just a sound. Then, nothing. Tanaka tried to traverse the turret toward the muzzle flashes, but the hand crank required both hands and his right hand wasn't responding properly. He looked down and saw blood. His own blood. A round or a fragment had torn through his forearm. The pain hadn't registered yet, would register in a moment, but in this instant there was only confusion and the realization that he needed to do something, needed to return fire, needed to command his crew. "Driver, reverse!" he shouted into the voice tube. "Get us back to the river!" The driver was already trying. The tank lurched backward, tracks spinning on loose sand. More 50 caliber fire raked the hull. Tanaka could hear the impacts, could hear the distinctive sound of penetration. Not the loud clang of bullets bouncing off, but a sharper, cleaner sound. The sound of armor failing. The tank's engine coughed, stumbled. The driver gave it more throttle, but the response was wrong. Something in the engine compartment had been hit. The cooling system, maybe, or the fuel lines, or any of a dozen vulnerable components that kept the diesel running. The Chiha rolled perhaps 10 meters before the engine died completely. They were stuck on the beach, 40 meters from the sandbar, under fire from multiple marine positions. "Bail out," Tanaka ordered. "Abandon the tank." The driver and bow machine gunner scrambled out through the forward hatches. Tanaka pulled himself up through the turret hatch, fell more than and climbed down the side of the hull, and stumbled toward the water. Behind him, the Chiha began burning. Whether from the fuel system rupturing or ammunition cooking off, he didn't know and didn't wait to find out. He ran for the river, ran for the relative cover of the darkness and the jungle on the western bank. Rifle fire followed him. Machine gun bursts churned the sand around his feet. He dove into the water, went under, let the current carry him downstream away from the killing zone. When he surfaced, gasping, he could see the entire sandbar illuminated by burning tanks. 5, 6, maybe 7 vehicles on fire. The entire 1st Independent Tank Company, destroyed in less than 30 minutes. The infantry that was supposed to follow the tanks never made it across. Marine artillery had the approach routes zeroed in. As Japanese soldiers attempted to advance in support of the armor, 105mm howitzers dropped high explosive shells on their assembly areas. Without tank support, without any way to suppress the marine defenses, the infantry attack stalled before it truly began. By midnight, the battle at the Matanikau was over. The Japanese forces withdrew back to their positions west of the river. The planned coordinated attack, with tanks assaulting from the west while infantry struck from the south, had failed before General Maruyama's forces even reached their jumping-off positions. The delay in getting troops through the jungle, the failure to synchronize the multi-pronged assault, had given the Marines time to concentrate their defenses. But the tactical failure, significant as it was, mattered less than the revelation about Japanese armor. In the morning light of October 24th, Marines walked among the destroyed tanks on the sandbar. They examined the vehicles carefully. Intelligence officers took photographs, made measurements, wrote detailed reports. The findings would circulate through Marine units for the remainder of the campaign and beyond. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank, Japan's most widely produced armored vehicle, was vulnerable to standard infantry heavy weapons. The 50 caliber machine gun, already ubiquitous in American forces, could penetrate the tank's armor at combat ranges. The 37mm anti-tank gun, considered borderline obsolete in Europe, where it struggled against German armor, was devastatingly effective against Japanese tanks. Even the 2.36-inch bazooka, which would arrive later in the Pacific campaign, could defeat Chiha armor from any angle. Marines examining the wrecked tanks on the Matanikau noted the clean holes punched through the armor by 50 caliber rounds. On several vehicles, the entry and exit holes were visible on opposite sides of the hull. The bullets had gone completely through. At close range, the armor-piercing rounds had more than sufficient energy to penetrate, cross the interior fighting compartment, and exit with enough momentum remaining to pose a danger on the other side. The internal layout shocked American observers. Marine tankers, accustomed to the relatively spacious interiors of their M3 Stuart light tanks and the even more accommodating M4 Sherman medium tanks, could hardly believe anyone could fight effectively in such cramped conditions. The commander's position in the turret provided barely enough room to stand. There was no seat, no proper resting position. The commander had to operate the main gun, load the main gun, traverse the turret manually, and somehow maintain situational awareness, all while standing in a space that measured less than 4 feet across. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ammunition storage was crude, with shells racked directly on the turret walls. The vision equipment consisted of small periscopes and direct vision ports that provide minimal situational awareness. The manual turret traverse required significant physical effort to rotate even a few degrees. Everything about the design spoke to compromises forced by industrial limitations and design choices that prioritized different values than American or European tank development. But the most damning discovery was the armor itself. Marines conducted simple tests. They fired 50 caliber rounds at disabled Chiha hulls from various distances and angles. At 200 meters, every shot penetrated. At 300 meters, penetration remained consistent. At 400 meters, the armor-piercing rounds still went through more often than not. Only at ranges exceeding 500 meters did the penetration become inconsistent, and even then, many rounds still defeated the thin steel. The implications were clear. Any Marine unit equipped with 50 caliber machine guns, which meant virtually every Marine unit on Guadalcanal, could engage and destroy Japanese tanks with reasonable confidence. The psychological impact of facing armor would be minimal. The fear that came with seeing enemy tanks advancing toward your position, a fear that froze inexperienced troops and caused veterans to seek cover, would not materialize in the Pacific theater. Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. This intelligence spread quickly through Marine ranks. Units planning operations no longer factored Japanese armor as a significant concern. When tank contact was reported, the response was to engage with available heavy weapons, rather than calling for specialized anti-tank support or airstrikes. The 50 caliber machine gun, already loved by Marines for its reliability and hitting power, gained an additional role as an improvised tank destroyer. For Japanese tank crews throughout the Pacific, the implications were catastrophic. The Battle of the Matanikau was not an isolated incident. It was the first time Japanese armor faced American forces in a prepared defensive position on Guadalcanal, but the same pattern would repeat on every subsequent island where Japanese tanks were committed to combat. The fundamental mismatch between Chiha armor protection and American infantry weapons meant that Japanese tankers were fighting in vehicles that could not protect them. At Saipan in June 1944, the pattern established at the Matanikau repeated on a much larger scale. Colonel Takashi Guto's 9th Tank Regiment, equipped with 44 tanks including both Type 97 Chihas and Type 95 Hargo light tanks, conducted the largest Japanese armoured assault of the Pacific War. They attacked Marine positions on the night of June 16th through 17th in a coordinated assault with infantry from the 136th Regiment. The result was slaughter. Marine 50 caliber machine gunners engaged the advancing Japanese armor and discovered, exactly as their colleagues at Guadalcanal had discovered, that their rounds penetrated easily. Marines reported watching tracer rounds punch through tank hulls, seeing the impacts light up the interiors through vision ports and hatches. 37mm anti-tank guns destroyed tanks with single shots. M4 Sherman tanks, when they engaged, outclassed the Japanese armor so completely that the encounters were less battles than executions. By dawn, 31 Japanese tanks littered the battlefield. Perhaps 1,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. The attack had accomplished nothing. The Marines at Saipan, unlike their predecessors at Guadalcanal, knew what to expect from Japanese tanks. The intelligence from 2 years of Pacific fighting had been clear. Japanese armor was thin, Japanese guns were weak, and standard Marine infantry weapons were effective against them. There was no surprise, no uncertainty, no fear, just methodical destruction of an outmatched enemy. Japanese tank commanders at Saipan, unlike Tanaka at the Matanikau, likely knew before the battle what they were facing. By mid-1944, Reports of tank losses throughout the Pacific had filtered through the Imperial Japanese Army. Tank crews knew their armor was inadequate. They knew 50 caliber machine guns could penetrate. They knew their 57mm guns, and even the improved 47mm guns on the Shin-Hoto variants could not reliably penetrate Sherman armor from the front. They knew, and they attacked anyway, not from ignorance or confidence, but from duty and lack of alternatives. Japan's industrial capacity could not produce better tanks in meaningful numbers. The newer Type 3 Chi-Nu and Type 4 Chi-To tanks, with heavier armor and more powerful guns, existed primarily as prototypes and limited production runs. They were being saved for the defense of the Japanese home islands. The tanks available for Pacific Island garrisons were the same Chi-Has and Hagos that had proven inadequate at Guadalcanal. The experience of Japanese tank crews during the later Pacific campaigns was one of grim acceptance. They understood their vehicles were death traps. They understood that American weapons could penetrate their armor from ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. They understood that in any engagement with American armor, they were overmatched. But the mission remained. The orders remained. Attack the landing forces, disrupt the beachhead, buy time for infantry to prepare defenses, die accomplishing whatever small tactical objective might slow the American advance. On Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese armor was largely absent from mobile operations. The few tanks present were dug into caves and used as stationary pillboxes, their mobility sacrificed in exchange for the protection provided by earth and rock. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, Colonel Takeichi Nishi's 26th Tank Regiment buried their tanks in the volcanic ash and sand, using them as armored bunkers, because the crews knew that in mobile warfare they would be destroyed within minutes. Even used as static defensive positions, the tanks remained vulnerable. 50 caliber machine guns could still penetrate turret armor. Flamethrower tanks could direct napalm into vision ports and hatches. Bazookas could penetrate from any angle. Demolition charges placed by marine infantry could destroy the vehicles completely. The tanks that had once represented the cutting edge of Japanese armored warfare had become steel coffins for their crews. The fundamental problem was industrial. Japan lacked the manufacturing capacity to produce modern tanks in the quantities needed. The nation's steel production, always limited compared to Western powers, was insufficient to meet the demands of naval construction, aircraft production, and ground vehicle manufacturing simultaneously. Strategic priorities favored the Navy and Air Force. The Army received what remained, and what remained was never enough. American tank production, by contrast, operated on a scale that would have seemed impossible to Japanese planners. The Detroit tank arsenal alone produced more tanks in a single peak production month than Japan produced in an entire year. The Fisher Tank Arsenal, the American Locomotive Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, and half a dozen other manufacturers churned out Sherman tanks by the thousands. By war's end, American factories had built over 49,000 Sherman tanks. Japan produced approximately 2,300 Chi-Ha tanks, including the improved Shin-Hoto variants, over the entire course of the war. The numerical disparity was 20-1. The qualitative disparity was even greater. A Sherman tank weighed 30 to 35 tons, depending on variant. It had armor ranging from 51mm on the hull front to 76mm on the turret mantlet. It carried a 5-man crew with dedicated positions for each role. It had a gyro-stabilized 75mm gun that could fire while moving. It had radio equipment in every tank, enabling coordinated operations. It was reliable, with tracks that lasted 2,500 miles compared to perhaps 1,000 miles for Japanese tank tracks. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II. German Tigers and Panthers outgunned it. But in the Pacific theater, where it faced Japanese tanks designed in the mid-1930s, the Sherman was overwhelmingly superior. Every aspect of design, from armor protection to firepower to crew comfort to mechanical reliability, favored the American tank. And the Americans had them in numbers that Japanese forces could never match. By Okinawa in April 1945, the last major battle of the Pacific War, The pattern was fully established. The 27th Tank Regiment defended the island with 13 Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks and 14 Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha medium tanks, 27 tanks total. The Americans landed with over 800 tanks. The numerical disparity was 30-1. The qualitative disparity made combat between American and Japanese armor less a battle than a foregone conclusion. On May 4th and 5th, 1945, Japanese forces launched their final major counteroffensive on Okinawa. Tank units were committed to support the infantry assault. Most of the Japanese tanks were destroyed within hours, knocked out by a combination of Sherman tanks, bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, artillery, and 50 caliber machine guns. The survivors withdrew, having accomplished nothing except adding more destroyed hulls to the battlefield. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945 and invaded Manchuria, Japanese tank units in northern China faced yet another technologically superior opponent. Soviet T-34 medium tanks with their sloped armor and powerful 76mm guns vastly outclassed the Japanese tanks opposing them. In the Battle of Shumshu Island, part of the Kuril chain, Japanese tanks attempted to defend against Soviet amphibious landings. The Soviets used 45mm anti-tank guns, anti-tank rifles, and anti-tank grenades to devastating effect. The Japanese lost 21 tanks in approximately 2 hours of fighting. Soviet forces, experienced in armored warfare from years of fighting on the Eastern Front in Europe, made short work of the Japanese defenders. The tactics that had worked against Chinese forces in the 1930s, the aggressive charges and close-range engagements, were suicidal against opponents with modern anti-tank weapons and combined arms doctrine. Japanese tank crews discovered, as their Navy counterparts had discovered at Midway and their infantry had discovered throughout the Pacific, that courage and fighting spirit could not overcome fundamental material disadvantages. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, once a symbol of Japanese armored might, had become obsolete before the Pacific War even began. The design specifications that made sense in the mid-1930s, when the tank was intended primarily for operations against Chinese forces with limited anti-tank capability, became fatal liabilities when facing American and Soviet forces with modern weapons. The armor that was calculated to resist rifle fire could not resist 50 caliber machine guns. The 57mm gun, designed for infantry support, could not penetrate modern tank armor. The cramped interior that minimized weight and simplified production made it nearly impossible for crews to fight effectively under combat stress. The manual turret traverse that reduced mechanical complexity left commanders exhausted after even brief engagements. Every design choice that had seemed reasonable given Japan's constraints became a vulnerability in actual combat. For the Japanese tank crews who fought at the Matanikau, at Saipan, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, the experience was one of gradual, crushing realization. What they had believed about their equipment, about their training, about their ability to compete with Allied armor was fundamentally wrong. The moment of truth for many came not in some epic tank duel between armored champions, but in the terrible simplicity of watching machine gun bullets punch through armor that was supposed to protect them. The Marines who fought at Guadalcanal learned different but equally important lessons. They learned that Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. They learned that proper equipment and overwhelming firepower made all the difference. They learned that their 50 caliber machine guns, which they had trained with and maintained throughout their service, were actually effective anti-tank weapons in the Pacific theater when engaging thinly armored Japanese vehicles. There was no glory in these lopsided battles. Marines didn't feel heroic, shooting at tanks with machine guns and watching them burn. They felt a mixture of relief, pity, and grim satisfaction. Relief that they didn't have to face serious armor opposition, the kind their counterparts in Europe dealt with daily against German tanks. Pity for the men in those Japanese tanks who had been sent to die in equipment that offered them no real protection. Satisfaction that their weapons worked, that American industry had given them the tools they needed to do their job. After the war ended, surviving Chi-Ha tanks were shipped to various locations for detailed examination. American engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland studied them carefully over months. They measured armor thickness at multiple points, documenting the variations. They tested the quality of the steel using metallurgical analysis. They evaluated the internal layout, taking detailed measurements and photographs. The reports confirmed what had been learned in combat. The armor was face-hardened steel, effective against small arms fire, but inadequate against larger projectiles. The maximum thickness was 33 mm on the gun mantlet of some variants, but most armor measured 20 to 25 mm. The internal arrangement was cramped to the point of being actively dangerous, even without enemy fire. The commander's workload, handling all turret functions alone, was unrealistic. The lack of radio equipment in 3 of every 4 tanks made coordinated operations nearly impossible. Every aspect of the design reflected the constraints Japan faced: limited industrial capacity, resource scarcity, and design philosophy rooted in experiences against inferior opponents. The comparison with American tanks revealed the full extent of the design philosophy differences. Where the Chiha was cramped, the Sherman was relatively spacious. Where the Chiha had thin armor vulnerable to machine gun fire, the Sherman resisted dedicated anti-tank guns. Where the Chiha had a single-person turret crew performing multiple simultaneous tasks, the Sherman had 3 men in the turret with specialized roles. But the most telling difference was not in the individual tanks. It was in the numbers and in the industrial systems that produced them. The United States had built an economy that could wage industrial warfare on a global scale. Factories that had produced automobiles now produced tanks at rates that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. Women who had never worked in heavy industry welded tank hulls and assembled turrets. Engineers constantly improved designs, incorporating lessons learned in combat. The supply chain delivered raw materials to factories and finished tanks to ports with clockwork efficiency. Japan had never built this kind of industrial system. Its economy was strained by years of war in China before the Pacific War even began. Its factories lacked the automation and mass production efficiency of American plants. Its access to raw materials, particularly after American submarines began sinking merchant shipping, was increasingly constrained. The nation that had challenged the world's greatest industrial power was discovering the true cost of that challenge with each new battle. For Tanaka, if he survived the Matanikau River crossing, the remainder of the war would have been a succession of retreats and defeats. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were eventually evacuated in February 1943 after months of brutal fighting. Those who made it off the island were shipped to other defensive positions throughout the Pacific, always falling back, always outnumbered and outgunned, always fighting with equipment that was obsolete before it reached the front lines. The night of October 23, 1942 represented more than a tactical defeat for Japanese armor. It represented the moment when the fundamental inadequacy of Japanese tank design became undeniable. The Chiha was not just outmatched. It was obsolete. Its armor could not protect against weapons the Americans used as standard infantry support. Its gun could not penetrate American armor. Its crew could barely operate the vehicle under combat conditions. And there was nothing Japanese tank crews could do about it except continue fighting with what they had, knowing that survival was unlikely and victory impossible. The factories back in Japan could not produce better tanks fast enough. The industrial capacity did not exist. The resources were not available. The strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where even if better tanks could be manufactured, there was no way to transport them to the islands where they were needed. The Type 97 Chiha tanks on subsequent Pacific battlefields represented more than just obsolete armor. They represented the gap between what Japan needed and what Japan could produce. They represented the impossible situation Japanese soldiers faced, ordered to fight a superpower with equipment that was never designed for that kind of war. They represented the consequences of strategic decisions made years earlier, to prioritize naval and air power over ground forces, to assume that fighting spirit could compensate for material inferiority, to believe that early victories indicated long-term viability. When those first 50 caliber rounds punched through Chiha armor on the Matanikau sandbar, They proved something that would echo through the rest of the Pacific War and into post-war analysis. They proved that in industrial warfare between modern nations, production capacity matters, design philosophy matters, resource allocation matters. No amount of courage, training, or tactical skill can overcome a 20-to-1 numerical disadvantage combined with generational gaps in equipment quality. The Japanese tank crews who climbed into their chihas on Pacific Islands throughout 1943, 1944, and 1945 knew what they were facing. They knew their armor was thin. They knew American machine guns could penetrate. They knew their chances were minimal. They climbed in anyway, started their engines, and drove toward enemy positions because the orders remained and the mission remained, and there were no alternatives. The Marines who watched Japanese tanks burn on beaches and in jungles throughout the Pacific understood that they were witnessing not just military defeat, but industrial mismatch on a scale rarely seen in warfare. The United States had mobilized an economy capable of producing weapons in quantities that overwhelmed any opponent. The Detroit Arsenal's monthly production exceeded Japan's annual production. The workers on American assembly lines, many of them women who had never worked in heavy industry before the war, were as important to victory as the soldiers and Marines fighting on Pacific Islands. The Battle of the Matanikau, though minor compared to the massive engagements in Europe, revealed this truth in miniature. 9 Japanese tanks crossed a river and were destroyed in less than an hour by Marines with standard infantry weapons. The tanks that were supposed to break the Marine defensive line became burning wrecks on a sandbar. The infantry that was supposed to follow the tanks never crossed. The coordinated offensive that was supposed to recapture Henderson Field failed before it truly began. And in the wreckage of those tanks, in the clean round holes punched through armor by 50 caliber machine guns, lay the evidence of a larger truth. Japan had challenged a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, and the consequences of that challenge were written in steel and blood on every Pacific battlefield. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.